a rock and roll band.
It's actually not too bad. I don't mind that. So maybe I do need a little bit more. The 5 rules of mixing. It was from 6 days ago, and it's got 29,000 views. It is worth a watch. I've linked it down in the description of this video under the show notes. So jump in and watch the whole video yourself afterwards if you want to. It's 28 minutes long, but it's a quick watch. Like, it goes through, because there's so much detail and so much content in there, and Warren is just a super engaging dude that you're going to get through it quickly. But what I thought is I would give you, I'm going to cut to the chase here and give you the 5 tips that Warren put out there. Still definitely go and watch the video, but I want your thoughts on these as well. Do you agree, disagree? Should rules even exist in mixing? That's the first thing. I don't know. We'll talk about it. So the first thing that Warren talked about was creating balance is a rule of mixing. So balance in terms of your volume, in terms of your panning, in terms of your EQ. And that one of the most important things is to get a static mix where things are balanced. You don't want everything to be all over on the left or all over on the right. You don't want your kick drum to be way up and your snare drum to be way down. You don't want your guitars to be super loud and your vocals to be super quiet sitting under the mix. So that is sort of rule number 1. And this is something that I tend to actually use when I'm mixing, because I have been mixing. Let's see if this is going to work. Am I still sharing here? I am. So I'm mixing a song at the moment. I'm mixing this tune, which is my Back to the Future inspired tune at the moment. And if you watch my mixing video, one of the first things I did here is a static mix. So I came in here and I got all my levels sitting right so that all of my different instruments were in the right zone. So I do think that a static mix is important, but I'm interested. Is that something that you do? Is getting your mix right? Do you focus in on your volume levels and your panning and make sure that everything there is sitting right first? Or do you go off and do other things? I don't know. And is it a rule? If you don't do it, is that bad? And this is the thing that gets to me. Whenever I hear rules, I get a little bit concerned. I don't know. Yeah, there you go. So Inside Bilderberg watched it yesterday, as did Gino Therese. So you were already all over it. And if you have already watched it, then you can find you'll already know it. But if you haven't, you can watch along. So that's sort of number 1. Number 2 was using plugins too early in a mix. So jumping in here, and instead of going, oh yeah, I'll just get my mix right, just going, oh well, I'll just throw a bunch of compression on here, and I'll do a bunch of EQ, and I'll do a bunch of other moves. I'll come in here to my effects, which I don't have here. I'll go into my effects, and I'll just add in a bunch of stuff to try and make it. And the one point that he made a lot in this section was about EQ. That a lot of people just go in and they just start EQing everything really early on. They'll EQ their vocals, they'll EQ their guitars, they'll EQ all of the different instruments before they've done a static mix, and therefore they're influencing and impacting things. And I've said this a lot, and I think Jade Starr has said it in recent shows as well. EQ should be there to fix things when you need it. If you're getting it right at the source, you shouldn't need a whole lot in the way of EQ. EQ is a good thing if you want to enhance something by boosting it, or if you want to use subtractive EQ, if you've got a frequency that's too noisy. And the best uses of EQ, which Warren gets to in a future tip, is to actually reduce down your low end. Because a lot of your tracks don't need much bass at all. So they don't need a whole lot of low end. And if you're getting any sort of rumble, or you're getting any sort of noise in your vocals, in your guitars, in your strings, in your acoustics, in your bass, well, not your bass, in your instruments, then you may want to use what's called a high pass or a low cut filter. And I've showed this in previous videos. In fact, I'll give you a quick demo here, because I showed it on a, hang on, I've just got to reload. I brought up GarageBand here and it had puppies. I showed it in a previous video where we looked at the LRC, the LRC7, here it is, LRC7 mixer. Boom. So there it is. So that's what you do in terms of a high pass filter. All you're doing is grabbing and rolling off all of the sounds below a certain level. And you can do the same at the top. You can do a low pass filter, which means you're only passing sounds below a certain level. So if you're getting build up in the low end, or if you're getting build up in the top end that you want to try and remove, then grabbing an EQ and removing that like that is something you can do. But again, Warren's tip is don't do that too soon. Don't get in there and jump in and start EQing to your heart's content until you've got your static mix sorted out. Tip number 3 is don't use plugins too late. So yeah, it's one of those things, and this is why I don't think it's really rules, because rules are like always do this, always do that. He basically said, don't use plugins too early, but don't hang around and wait. And I agree with this too, because what he said is start shaping and start fixing some of the things that you need to. So if there is something sticking out in a vocal that you need to EQ and you want to come in here and you want to grab some EQ and you're like, oh, my vocal just needs a little bit of sweetening up the top here, or there's this one frequency that I really don't want in there, then yeah, you can start changing some of those things. You can start using compression. I use compression pretty early on because it really gives me an indication of where it's going to sit. I often just turn the compressor on when I record vocals and just leave it on because I find that that's an easy way to do things as well. So that's the other thing. Don't just leave it all to the end. When I first started, I got some terrible advice, and tell me if you've done this or if you consider this yourself. The terrible advice was record everything in completely clean, no effects, no compression, no EQ, and then save all of your mixing to the end. And I took this advice and I struggled through because I got no life in my guitars. I got no life in my vocals. I couldn't hear the song coming together. So if I had added a little reverb, a little delay, some compression, some EQ, doesn't have to be what you're going to have at the final mix. But if you put nothing in there, I just found personally that I couldn't hear the song coming through. And just adding a little bit of that sprinkling early, mixing as you go, was something that really worked out for me. What do you think? Let me know. Mark says, I watched it also. To me, they're more like guidelines and common sense when you know what you're doing. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I think it's more that the YouTube algorithm thing where it's like, if you go 5 rules for mixing, Warren's team probably looked up and probably used something like TubeBuddy that we'll look at later and went, let's do some keyword research. 5 guidelines for mixing? No one's searching that. 5 rules for mixing? Oh, look, everyone's searching that. Let's go with that. I mean, it may not be, but if Warren's a smart creator and has a good team, which he is and he does, then that's what they would have done, and that's why they would have used rules instead of guidelines or principles or whatever you might want to say there. So that was rule number 3. Rule number 4, and this is interesting for me right now because I've been getting super excited because I've been using Cubasis as opposed to GarageBand on my latest song. So I'm just going to load Cubasis back up here in the background. I've been using this one, Cubasis, and this has a master bus. So yeah, we can come in here to our master bus if we scroll on across. And you can actually add effects to the master bus. You can add this master strip, which has a multi-band compressor, stereo imager, loudness maximizer, and we've got a brick wall limiter in there as well. Now, Warren's 4th tip was don't use these master plugins too early. So there's a concept, and I think Graham Cochran over at what is the name of his channel? Someone help me out. I remember produce, mix, and Joe Gilder's Home Studio Corner. These folks have talked about that. And what they basically say is, once you've got your mix here, instead of going into each individual track and adding things like compression and all the other, and EQ, start by going to your mix bus, because you can just fix a lot of that by just putting EQ or compression or multi-band compression on your master track. And then you can go back and tweak your individual tracks if you want. And they call it top-down mixing. Now, Warren's basically come out and said, don't do that, because what tends to happen is, let's just say with this track here, I have a bass, because I do. Let's just solo this bass. It's a synth bass here, and it sounds like this. Let's just say that was super overloaded, super muddy in the low to mids. If I just said, hey, my overall track that sounds like this, if I thought, oh, there's too much mud down in the low end, I know a quick way to fix it is to come in here and to grab this and go to my master strip and then just reduce down, like EQ out the bottom end, or reduce the amount of compression that I have on the low end, or maybe up the compression at the top end. That'll work, but it's also impacting every other track. And what if there's some tracks in there? What if the kick drum actually needs that thud down in the 50 hertz or 100 hertz? I could be impacting that as well as this. So Warren's point here was, instead of going to your mix bus and making your changes there, saying, oh, there's too much low end, there's too much high end, find where it's coming from and then tweak the tracks. So actually do your mixing on the individual channels as opposed to the overall mix bus. What do you think about that? Look, I have used top-down mixing before where I've thrown things on the master channel. It does work well, but Warren's point here was that it's really easy to get an okay mix doing that. It makes it harder to get an exceptional mix doing that. So I don't know. I'm on the fence here because I'm all for ease. And let's keep in mind, Warren is a professional. He's in a professional studio. He's got a big SSL console in front of him. He's at the high. He's mixed Aerosmith songs, for goodness sake. So he's at the high end. He's not necessarily at the home studio creator level. So for someone creating in the home studio, maybe using top-down mixing is going to be a thing. So let's move to number 5, and that was to always be thinking globally and not use solo. Hands up who gets into the very bad habit of soloing their stuff and then adding compression, adding EQ, adding effects, and it sounds great. That soloed vocal sounds epic. And then you bring it back into the mix, and what happens? It sounds horrible. It's all muddy. It's all cruddy. You don't like it. Well, that's because no one's listening to your song in solo. So this is one thing that I agree with Warren almost 100% on. And that is, I've got into the trap of doing this before, where you listen in solo. You're not listening to the entire track. And if you're trying to mix and you're trying to add effects to especially things like vocals or guitars, bass, or anything really, and you're doing it in solo, and it's really not going to work for you. Let's go for a quick demo here. So if we come in here to my track, which I can't show you because I'm there. So if I was trying to EQ this vocal, I wanted to add some effects to this vocal. If I'm listening to this vocal, I could go, all right, here it is, and let's play it.
1985, late for class, but feeling fine 'cause I have a rock and roll band.
So it's sounding okay. I'm getting some clicks and pops there. I think I need to come in here and change my audio. So yeah, I've got this for super low latency. I need to give away a little latency while I'm mixing here. So yeah, what I could do, you can see I've come in here and I've changed all of these things. Look, I've got a channel strip, 2 delays, a chorus, another reverb, a studio EQ there, and I've got wider on there to give some stereo width. So if I was doing all of this and starting to make tweaks and only had that soloed, I can't hear what that's doing to the rest of the mix. So what should you be doing? Well, every time I'm coming in here and I'm tweaking something like this reverb, I should have it on here, because at the moment, I'll just remember I've got 5% mixed in. If we had this soloed, so let's say we have this soloed and we wanted to come in here and we're mixing in. We're saying, okay, how much of this reverb do we want? Well, at the moment we've got 5%. Let's just tweak it.
Late for class, but feeling fine 'cause I have a rock and roll band.
We might go, hey, 20% sounds good. It doesn't. But 20% sounds good in this mix. But then when we bring it back into our overall mix, take a listen.
85, late for class, but feeling fine 'cause I have a rock and roll band.
It's actually not too bad. I don't mind that. So maybe I do need a little bit more. But again, if we're playing with this and we're actually right here in the mix, it makes it easier to hear what that effect is going to do.
Got a call from my older friend, working on a way to bend the space.
So there you go. We're going to go with about 12%. And I was experimenting with, as you can see, there's something missing there, is this lead analog synth. I was experimenting with having this muted in the first verse. It's a little bit too vacant, isn't it? So it's actually like this.
Back in 1985, late for class.
Yeah, that's better. So that's kind of the final point there, is it is so much better to have your whole track playing. Solo is okay if you're doing things like editing. So if you want to edit out your breath sounds or you want to do some automation, but the majority of things are really better if you're listening to your whole track at once rather than being in solo. But I don't know. What's your opinion on that?